I am absolutely thrilled and very excited about our speaker today. If I gave you a complete rundown of his life and his accomplishments, we would be able to start interviewing him at about 7 o'clock tonight, so I'm not going to. But I will tell you that Alan Dershowitz was born in Williamsburg, Brooklyn, to an Orthodox Jewish couple. He was raised in Borough Park, and his first job was at a deli factory in Manhattan's Lower East Side in 1952 at the age, I believe, of 14, but don't extrapolate from there. He attended Yeshiva University High School, an independent boys' prep school owned by Yeshiva University in Manhattan, where he played on the basketball team. He was a rebellious student, often criticized by his teachers. He later said his teachers told him to do something that, quote, requires a big mouth and no brain. So he says, I became a lawyer, end quote. After graduating from high school, he studied political science at Boston College, graduated magna cum laude, then, of course, Yale Law School, editor-in-chief of the Yale Law Journal, and he graduated in 1962, ranked first in his class. Was Joe Biden up there with you? Okay. So will you join me with a great round of applause welcoming Alan Dershowitz.
Thank you, Rob.
His lady microphone. So, first of all, we are going to cover three major topics this afternoon. One, of course, will be what's going on in Israel with respect to the judicial system, the Supreme Court. Secondly, we will be covering the media and how the media impacts our thoughts in this country about Israel and a potential lawsuit that is happening. And thirdly, just briefly about some of the recent U.S. Supreme Court decisions and something I read this morning that ties into that could be extremely interesting. But first, I would like to ask Professor Dershowitz if he would tell us a little bit, since we're sitting in the Chabad JCC, about his experience with the Lubavitcher Rebbe.
Well, thank you so much. I have to admit, I am surprised by the size of this crowd. I had no idea. 2 weeks ago, my wife and I were vacationing in Tanglewood listening to music, and of course, the rabbi found out we were there. You know the old joke about when Biden got into office, he was told by his national security advisor that the Jews in Borough Park know about everything before it happened. And Biden says, let me find out for myself. So he puts on a wig, payas, and a beard, and puts on a little accent, and he goes to Borough Park, and he meets the first person, and he says, "Vos titzach, what's happening?" And the guy says, "I hear that Biden's in Borough Park." So they know everything. And so the Rebbe last week found out Dershowitz is in Tanglewood. So, of course, invited me to the Minyan on Shabbos, and I spoke, and I have never turned down a Chabad invitation. It's one of the most wonderful organizations in the world, and I'll tell you a little bit later about some of the things it's done. My history with the Rebbe. So Dr. Falk will confirm that our yeshiva, the one we both went to together, Brooklyn Talmudical Academy, was strategically located halfway between Ebbets Field and the Lubavitch headquarters. And at the end of the day, when we were let out of school, we would often try to sneak into Ebbets Field and watch games. But my best friend at BTA was Tzvi Groner, and his uncle was the Rebbe's mashkiach, or whatever you call him, but the second in command, the guy who helped him very much. And he said to me one day, Avi, my name was Avi when I was in high school. My mother gave me a real name when I got to college. Said, let's go have lunch with my uncle. It's only a few blocks away. So it was Friday afternoon. We got out of school early. We walked to Lubavitch headquarters on Eastern Parkway. And we sit down having our lunch, and suddenly this man with these piercing eyes and a black beard walks in and says, you know, with his European accent, so what are you studying in the Talmud? And I said, Baba Metzia. And he says, all right, I will give you a little bechina, a test on Baba Metzia. I have no idea whether I passed or failed, but that was my first encounter with the Rebbe. My second encounter was after I finished clerking for Justice Arthur Goldberg in the Supreme Court. He decided to run for governor. And so he asked me if I could arrange a meeting with the Lubavitcher Rebbe. And so I did, and I was invited to sit in on the meeting. The third meeting I had with him was quite contentious. I was deeply involved, through Elie Wiesel, in being the lawyer for Soviet Jews. I went to the Soviet Union throughout the 1970s, met with people like Sharansky and all of the leaders, and held demonstrations, including a very large one in New York where I think 100,000 people showed up. The Rebbe called for me. And he said, I appreciate what you're doing, but quiet diplomacy is the way to go. And I am working very quietly behind the scenes to bring about the release of hundreds of thousands of Jews. At the time, I was defending two Jews, a person named Dershowitz and a person whose name Kuznetsky, who had stolen an airplane with 8 Jews on it to go from Leningrad to Sweden, and they were sentenced to death. And I was their lawyer, and it was a horrible responsibility. Especially, you know, there was no money. I was doing it obviously free. And I traveled all over Europe on behalf of these guys, and finally met in the Vatican with the Pope's chief guy on human rights, met with the head of the Communist Party, believe it or not, who was Jewish. His name was Terezini, and we persuaded the Pope.
Not surprised.
Yeah. We persuaded the Pope to intervene, and they saved the lives of these two guys. And the Rebbe and I finally agreed it would be good to complement each other, me in the public sphere and him in the private sphere, and he brought about enormous, amazing results. And then my next encounter with Chabad was when a young rabbi, must have been 22, 23 years old, came to my office, no appointment at Harvard, and said, Professor Dershowitz, I want to establish Chabad at Harvard. I said, well, that's interesting. He said, all the other professors laugh at me. Chabad at Harvard? Big long beards with payas? At Harvard, the elite institution? I said, I'm on your side. I will be your faculty advisor. We'll make it happen. We established Chabad at Harvard. There are now 420 Chabads and universities and schools all over the world. It has changed. You know, we have a lot to fight about with professors and others, but Chabad has done a phenomenal job. And there's one more thing, and then we'll get to the next question. Chabad, through the Rebbe, established an organization called Aleph, and its job is to protect and defend Jews and others, but primarily Jews who are prisoners around the world. The slogan is, no Jew will ever be forgotten. And I work 50% of my time now. Half of my time, I work pro bono for Chabad and for Aleph, representing, most recently, a Jew in Ecuador who was beaten nearly to death, Jews in Ukraine, Jews all over the world, Jews in America. And that's all through Chabad. It's, for me, you know, I am, notwithstanding my kippah, I wear a kippah when I sit in front of an Aron Kodesh, but I am not Orthodox. I'm a traditional Jew. In fact, my next book is a provocative title that some of you may not like, but it's a reflection of me. It's called Why I Daven Like an Orthodox Jew. I do. I go to an Orthodox synagogue. I love Chazanim. Why I Daven Like an Orthodox Jew, Think Like an Agnostic, and Act Like an Atheist. Now, why do I say I act like an atheist? I'll tell you a secret. So, my son was going to college, so it's now many years ago. Get on the airplane. We're flying back. It was a great day in my life. The pilot announces, in fact, it was from here. It was from Stapleton Airport. And the pilot announces we have a terrible problem on board. The flaps won't go into landing position. We're going to have a forced landing. Anybody here who has experience in disaster control, everybody has to take their belts off, our shoes off, our glasses off. And he said you have an hour and we're going to land, and it's going to be a very, very rough landing. And I saw people around me with their rosaries, other people. It never occurred to me for 1 second to think about God. It just didn't happen. I wrote letters to my children. I wrote letters to friends. But I discovered that God was not a major influence on my life. I didn't decide not to believe necessarily. I'm an agnostic. I don't know. I'll never know. When I get up there, I'll find out. And I think Jefferson once said, God doesn't make deals with people. He doesn't say, if you didn't believe in me, don't ask for my help now. He wrote to his nephew saying, if you have at least tried your best to figure out what your relationship is, if any, to God, God will reward you for it. So I'm expecting that. I'm counting on that. But agnosticism is in the Jewish blood. How many rabbis do we know who actually get up in front of the congregation and have thoughts to themselves? What am I really doing? Is it for the community? Is it for survival of the Jewish people? Is it Mei Shemayim? So that's my relationship with religion. It changes all the time. And I'm an agnostic about everything. I'm an agnostic about evolution. I'm an agnostic about science. I'm an agnostic about every aspect of life. I think it's tremendous arrogance to think you can know the ultimate issues. I don't think I can know the ultimate issues.
Thank you. Okay, to the process at hand. Over the past 3 weeks, we have had a number of people come speak here about meritocracy. First, from medical schools, we had Dr. Stanley Goldfarb, who was the head of curriculum at Penn Medical, University of Pennsylvania, who left that position, started a nonprofit called Do No Harm because what he was seeing was happening in medical schools. First of all, admissions, doing away with testing, doing away with any kind of information that would tell us about the applicant. And secondly, he felt that we were making these pre-doctors into social justice warriors, not necessarily good doctors. In fact, one person who worked on the curriculum with him said to him, there's too much science in this curriculum. Go figure. Secondly, we had the head of the Department of Poli-Sci, political science from University of Colorado, Colorado Springs, who spoke to us about the threats to freedom of speech on campus. And then last week, we had Heather McDonald talking about the war on excellence in academia and beyond. Mm-hmm. And of course, her new book is When Race Trumps Merit. What we didn't talk about, and hopefully briefly, we didn't talk about law schools. So I want to ask you about what happened at Yale some time ago, Yale Law, what happened at Stanford Law more recently, when a portion of the student body who was going to hear Kyle Duncan, an appellate court justice, claimed that his mere presence somewhere on campus, even if they stayed away from him, was utterly intolerable. So here we have not only what we had in medical school about admissions and about what students are being taught, but here we had actual resistance. And what I'm confused about, aren't law students the ones who are going to be lawyers who are going to represent people they may not agree with? And I'm sitting with the Messiah of that concept. What is going on
Well, first of all, Jews have been afflicted with false messiahs for years, so don't try to pin that rap on me. First, let me start with medical school. Both of my grandchildren are now post-medical school, one at Columbia, one at Stanford. And so I'm deeply involved in the process of admissions and all of that. I'm going to make an admission here. It's much more important who becomes doctors than who becomes lawyers. We win, we lose. People do go to jail. I have saved people's lives. In a case not so long ago, I was not his lawyer, but Carolyn got me involved. At the very 2 days before Trump left office, she pleaded with me to try to get Trump to save the life of a 44-year-old black man who at the age of 19 killed 2 people but had completely become rehabilitated. I got Trump on the phone. He listened to me for half an hour, and he wouldn't commute the sentence, and the man was executed. I've never lost a case of execution where I've been the lawyer, and almost no good lawyers lose. That's one of the tragedies of the death penalty. It's the penalty for having a bad lawyer, and the penalty for being a poor person, and the penalty for killing a white person is distinguished from a black person. People don't get the death penalty for killing black people, whether you're black or white. They get the death penalty for killing white people, whether you're black or white. So the death penalty is just horrible. But in general, what do lawyers do? They help rich people get richer. And they play an important role, and I played that role for many years. But doctors, pilots, engineers, our life depends on them. And nobody, no matter how strongly you believe in race-based affirmative action, and I've been critical of race-based affirmative action since 1974. I wrote my first article about it in 1974. Nobody, no matter how strongly you feel about it, wants to have a surgeon who is picked on anything other than meritocracy. Nobody wants to fly with a pilot who is picked on anything other than meritocracy. And it's a little bit hypocritical for people to say, well, but for the other areas, getting into college, getting into law school, we don't really care. Well, it matters too. I'm in favor of affirmative action based on individual disability, individual poverty, overcoming individual handicaps. But I was at Martin Luther King's speech on August 7th or 8th of 1963. I was a law clerk at the time. And I heard him say those words. I dream of a day when my children will be judged not by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. And so I suspect everybody in this room ultimately believes that we want an egalitarian society, a society where everybody is judged, a society where diversity grows out of meritocracy. And that's what we were moving away from at places like Harvard and Yale. And there's a direct relationship between that and the absence of free speech. What's happened is students are now admitted to law school and to colleges with a slight preference for people from the radical left. And it's not surprising that we see people from the radical left being the ones who decide who the speakers are. So I taught at Harvard for 50 years. I had 10,000 students. I was often voted the most popular teacher at the law school. I cannot be invited back to Harvard to speak. When I was invited to speak there by Chabad, they had to move the event off campus because they knew I would be disrupted and they thought perhaps even my safety would be endangered. That's how bad it has gotten. Now let me give you the other part of the news. It's getting worse. It's getting worse. And the Supreme Court's decision probably won't change it. Why? Because Professor Lawrence Tribe has already told Harvard, cheat, don't listen. Professor Tushkin wrote an article the other day. 2 Jewish Democrat civil liberties professors. Professor Tushkin wrote an article the other day saying that President Biden and Harvard University and others should simply ignore that decision because it's wrong and because the president has as much power to interpret the Constitution as the Supreme Court. Reversing 200 years of American history, Marlborough versus Madison. Now this happened once before in our lifetime, the lifetime of many of us, not all of you. In 1954, when Brown versus Board of Education was decided, ending segregation in schools, my wife Carolyn was a young child in segregated Charleston, South Carolina. What did the law professors in those days say from Alabama and from Mississippi? Defiance. Don't listen. Brown versus Board of Education was wrong. What's the difference between radical leftists like Tribe and Tushnet saying, ignore the Supreme Court decision, and Southern segregationists doing the same thing? We favor, obviously, integration and equality, and we despise what existed before 1954. But the Supreme Court, you know, I think my bar mitzvah was Bashert. I was bar mitzvahed on Pashat Shoftim. And there's two famous lines in Shoftim. One, we all know, Tzedek, Tzedek, Tirdov, justice, justice must you seek. The other few people know, and it's an instruction to judges. And there are two instructions. One, don't take bribes. That's easy, but that comes second. The first is lo takir panim. Do not recognize faces. Do not recognize races. Do not recognize genders. Do not recognize anything but the merit of the case. That's in Shoftim. That's the origin of the blindfold over justice. People think it's a Greek statue. No, it comes from Shoftim in Devarim. And I think that every person should be advocating full and complete equality. Now, it's not enough to say meritocracy. You have to put your money where your mouth is. Start putting money into young people, prenatal, natal care, education, kindergarten, elementary school. Don't start at the law school level. It's too late. Start when you can really, really make a difference. We all want equality.
Thank you. Thank you. Now, let's get to Israel. I'm going to ask you 3 questions, short ones,
okay.
And I'm going to ask you to answer as short as possible. How are judges appointed to the Supreme Court in the United States of America?
Politically, the president who wins the election makes the decision to nominate, and then the Senate, comprised of people who won their election, decides. The framers of the Constitution made a terrible mistake. They should have required a 2/3 vote for confirmation of the Supreme Court, as they did for treaties, but they didn't. They said a bare majority, so you get situations where the party who controls the Senate really has an enormous influence.
Thank you. Secondly, how do cases get to the United States Supreme Court? Do they go through lower courts? Can anybody just come and say, I want to sue the government?
No, in Israel, there's something called bagatz, where anybody can bring a lawsuit, usually Sunday morning. You see a lineup, I've been there, and people make their argument. The United States is much more difficult. You have to go to the district court first, then you have to go to the Court of Appeals, then you have to go for what's called a writ of certiorari, which is very discretionary. Only like 2% are granted. People are shocked to know that the Supreme Court decides only about 75 cases a year. The Israeli Supreme Court decides 25,000 cases a year. That's a tiny country. We're a big country. And that has been a cause of some of the problems.
Exactly. How are judges appointed in Israel?
It's a very elitist method, and it's worked extraordinarily well. Carol and I's best friend in Israel, I met him in 1966, is Aharon Barak, the former president of the Supreme Court. The 2 people I never go to Israel without having dinner with are my 2 oldest friends, Barak, who I met in 1966, and a kid named Benjamin Natai, who I met in 1970, changed his name to Netanyahu, you may have heard of him. And so these are 2 guys who are competing with each other over this judicial reform, and they're my two of my closest friends. And Carol and I were recently in Israel, and of course I met with both of them. And you know, I heard both sides, all sides of the story. But they're appointed by a mechanism that includes a plurality of professionals. That is, justices of the Supreme Court coupled with members of the bar, and a minority of members of the Knesset. So it's an elitist, non-political decision.
So basically, and correct me if I'm wrong on this, you underline the fact that Supreme Court judges in the United States are appointed by people who have been elected by the electorate. And it sounds like most of the people involved with the Israeli decisions are people who have been appointed.
That's right.
Not elected.
That's right.
Okay.
You know, I haven't been cross-examined in a long time. This is fun. Thank you.
I'm going to lose. Don't worry.
There's no winning and losing.
So, when a case goes to the Supreme Court, the Supreme
Which
Court
court?
of the
Which one?
United States
Yeah.
decides whether this is constitutional or it's not constitutional. Azoy, Israel doesn't have a constitution.
Yes, it does. It's just not a written constitution. Just like Great Britain has a constitution, but it's not a written constitution.
Like I said, it doesn't have a written constitution. But it does have something called reasonableness.
Yeah.
Reasonableness, which is somewhat vacuous, I might say, but please tell us about reasonableness, because it sounds like that kind of at the crux of this whole thing, right?
I think it's not. I think what's at the crux is the appointment process, but reasonableness is very important. And I am generally opposed to most of the reforms that have been proposed by the right wing, but I am not opposed to that reform. I don't believe that courts should have the power to decide whether legislative actions or military actions are reasonable. Reasonableness does not have any criteria. What's reasonable to you is not reasonable to me. And I just don't think there are objective criteria. And the Supreme Court has two words that it uses too often. Dignity is one. Justice Aaron Barak wrote a whole book on dignity. And he's one of the most, dignity-conscious people. He's a marvelous man. He's the John Marshall of Israel. He really formulated their law. But he focuses on dignity and he focuses on reasonableness. And if you believe in a kind of benevolent despotism, you want somebody who believes in and acts on reasonableness, but it's not particularly consistent with democracy. Democracy means the legislature has the right to make mistakes. Oliver Wendell Holmes put it very well. He said, if the legislature wants to have people go to hell on a sled, I'm not going to stand in their way as long as it's not unconstitutional. And that's why having a written constitution is better than not having. But remember the American Constitution, there are words in it just like reasonable. Due process, equal protection, cruel and unusual punishment. It's obvious when you have the provision of the Constitution that says you have to be 35 to be president. Some people hope there would be one that says you can't be 80, but that's not in the Constitution. It says only you have to be 35. If you're 34 in 364 days, you're not eligible, even if you're the most brilliant person in the world. And if you're 35 in a day and a raving nincompoop, you can get elected president. That's an objective line. Due process is not objective. You know what due process means? Think about it. The process that's due you. How do you objectify that? Well, you look back in history, and so the American Supreme Court is like the British Supreme Court and like the Israeli Supreme Court in defining terms like due process, equal protection, and reasonableness, but I'm not in favor of that. I'm not in favor of it in the United States either. I'm not in favor of what was called substantive due process that used to happen during the early days of the New Deal, and the Supreme Court would strike down minimum wage laws restricting children, saying it's a violation of due process or the right of contract. And so I would rather see the Supreme Court constrained by words, by actual words in a written constitution. I offered to help write a constitution in Israel in 1970, and I met with a group of people. And you know what they told me? It's too late. This is 1970. That's 22 years after the establishment of the state. It's too late. He said America couldn't have gotten a constitution 22 years after it was established. If you're going to have a constitution, you better have it that day, before the parties are formed, before sides are picked, and we were lucky. Now, we have a racist constitution. We made a compromise with the devil. Slavery is in the Constitution. It's in the Constitution. There's a limit to how long you can have it, but it's in the Constitution. And it took a civil war and 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments to change it. There are people who think we shouldn't have ratified our Constitution. There was too much division, but we did. We bit the bullet. We wrote a Constitution, and as John Marshall said, it's a Constitution that will endure forever. It's a Constitution we are expounding, and the courts have tried to interpret it in a reasonable manner, but without using reasonableness as the criteria. So the basic point is there's a dispute going on in Israel. It's none of our effing business. None. Sorry to use that word in this holy place. The United States should stay the heck out of it. Just like there are efforts now to pack the court in the United States. Israel's not going to get involved in that decision. That's a domestic decision. The issue in Israel is purely domestic. You know, the European community is condemning Israel because it wants to limit judicial review. Most countries in Europe don't even have judicial review at all. Talk about hypocrisy. But in Israel, there's no such thing as a domestic issue. Every time a bathroom is added to a home in Kilo, it becomes an international issue.
Thank you. Now, when the Supreme Court deems a law that was passed by Congress unconstitutional, the Congress can't say, we're going to overrule you because of checks and balances.
Well, there are two. Sometimes, yes. For example, this month's past decision on the loan forgiveness, the Supreme Court said, no, it was unconstitutional for the president to order loan forgiveness, but the legislature could do so.
Absolutely.
So sometimes you get decisions which throw the ball back to the legislature. Sometimes, like in the race-based cases, they say no institution of government, nobody who gets government funding can ever use race and race alone. And that was the right decision. Just one more example about that. You know what Harvard used to do in the beginning? They would give preference, racial preference, to a young black woman or man whose father was a hedge fund operator, whose mother was a federal judge, who went to Exeter and had the best education, the best health care in the country, lived in the most expensive neighborhood, just because of the color of the skin, over a kid from West Virginia whose mother, died of an overdose, whose father left the family. Race alone cannot, should not, ever be used as a criteria by government, period. And the Supreme Court finally said that. I wrote a piece in the Wall Street Journal, which was very controversial, in which I said I was a law clerk on the Supreme Court, the most liberal court in history, 63 to 64. Earl Warren was the Chief Justice, Douglas, black. That court would have ruled the same way. They would have found race-based affirmative action unconstitutional. And when Biden says this is not a normal court, it reflects his C average at Syracuse Law School. I'm going to vote for, by the way, I'm going to vote for Biden. So don't think that I'm making a political speech. Actually, I'm not going to vote for Biden. I'm going to vote against Trump. But that's a different matter.
Okay. Now,
but I'm going to tell the truth about both of you.
The most controversial part of this judicial reform in Israel was just that. They wanted the Knesset to be able to take a law or a decision by the Israeli Supreme Court and overturn it. So that has been removed.
No, that hasn't happened yet. Well, that's one of the proposals is what's called judicial override. That is that the Knesset could, by a simple majority vote, override any Supreme Court decision. When I went to see Bibi Netanyahu, I said, Mr. Prime Minister, I love you, I generally support you, I would never have voted for you, but, you're my friend. I can't support judicial override. I can support it if it involves non-human rights, non-minority decisions. I can understand judicial override if it's an economic decision. For example, the Supreme Court had to decide whether the gas deal in Lebanon was reasonable. If the court had said, no, the gas deal in Lebanon is not reasonable, the Knesset should be able to override that. Or decisions about who can be appointed to ministerial. But if the Supreme Court holds that minority rights demand this, or basic human rights or free speech, that should not be subject to judicial override. And Bibi told me that he thought that was a wise line to draw between the two, and he would seriously consider that. And I predict here today, I don't have firsthand knowledge, I predict here today he will favor that compromise. I've been working very closely with Isaac Herzog, one of the great men in Israel and Jewish history. The speech he made in front of Congress the other day was just absolutely remarkable. I wrote him a note immediately when I heard the speech, and within minutes, this busy man wrote me back a response. And he's a great man, and he's now trying very hard to bring about a compromise. But with people like Ben-Gvir and Smotrich and other extreme right-wingers that are essential to the majority in the Knesset, Bibi's hands are somewhat tied.
And that's the wonderful parliamentary system, which we're not going to touch on right now.
I hope we never get a parliamentary system. You know, we fought a revolution against the parliamentary system. We have a much better system.
Okay, so...
imperfect as it is, too. Yeah.
This was in the New Republic in 2007. Judge Richard Posner.
Good friend of mine.
Okay,
Yeah.
judge on the U.S. Circuit Court.
Now retired, yeah.
What Barak, this is Aaron Barak, what Barak created out of whole cloth was a degree of judicial power undreamed of even by our most aggressive Supreme Court justices. Mm-hmm. This is when the court was changed to this reasonableness, etc. Among the rules of law that Barak's judicial opinions have been instrumental in creating that have no counterpart in American law are any citizen can come and bring a case, they can countermand a military order, things like that. And he said Barak takes for granted that judges have inherent authority to override statutes, and he says such an approach can accurately be described as usurpative.
Okay, and he could have written exactly the same article about John Marshall in 1804. There's nothing in the United States Constitution that authorizes the Supreme Court to engage in judicial review. Nothing, not a word. Hamilton believed in it, wrote about it in the Federalist Papers. Nothing in the Constitution. He, John Marshall, out of whole cloth, invented judicial review and said the Supreme Court is now going to have the power to overrule not only decisions by the federal legislature, but decisions by state legislatures. And that was so controversial, because remember, in 1804, 1806, we were still the United States of America. Not until really Jacksonian democracy, and maybe even later, did we become the United States of America. The governor of Virginia was as important as the president of the United States in the early days of our federal system. And Marshall usurped that power. And what a good thing it was he did. Now, if you believe in a pure theory of democracy, you don't want judges to have that power. They are unelected. But you know what word was never mentioned? I read every word of the constitutional debates because I had to when I defended Trump in front of the Senate. The word democracy is never used in the debates. Nobody wanted a democracy. Benjamin Franklin, it's a republic if you can keep it. We didn't want a democracy because we saw what was going on in France. That was a democracy, and we didn't want it. We wanted a system of checks and balances. We wanted 2 senators from Wyoming as well as 2 senators from California. You know what that means? That a Wyoming voter has 5,000 times more influence in the Senate than a California voter. We voted this electoral college. Unbelievable. Who in their darkest dreams would ever imagine that you elect a president not by a majority vote, but by electors? And obviously we know that both Trump and Bush II won against overwhelming majorities against them. That's because we didn't want a democracy. And then with Jackson, we wanted a democracy. But the Constitution was the same. It didn't change. Look, the important point I want to make is a complex issue. It's a complex issue that deserves your attention as serious intellectuals who live in the United States. It deserves the attention of professors at law schools. These are great and interesting debates. We could go on and on. I could stay until 7 just talking about this. It is not an issue that should result in demonstrations in the street. It is not an issue that should result in Air Force pilots refusing to serve their country. It is not an issue that should result in people threatening the economy of Israel by saying we're going to drive high-tech companies out of Israel. This is an issue that should be resolved domestically in Israel, and it should be resolved, hopefully, with a compromise. But it's not an issue that deserves the kind of divisive political attention that it's been getting.
Amen. Now I'm just going to read one thing from Caroline Glick, who spoke here last year from Israel. One of the leaders of this protest, which have been somewhat violent, one of the leaders is Yair Lapid. Yair Lapid was a previous prime minister in the left-wing government, if you would, or the mixed government. And this is when he addressed a number of years ago the Kohelet Forum in Israel. In that speech, he said, and I quote, this is a leader of the protests.
Right.
I have opposed, and I still oppose, judicial activism of the sort introduced by Justice Aaron Barak. I don't think it's right that everything is justiciable. I don't think it's right for the Supreme Court to change fundamental things in accordance with what it refers to as the judgment of the, quote, the reasonable person, end quote. That's an amorphous and completely subjective definition that the Knesset never introduced to the legal code. It's not right in my mind that the separation of powers, the sacrosanct foundation of the democratic method, should be breached by one branch of government, placing itself above the others. The leader of these protests in the street.
That's because the protests have nothing to do with judicial reform. They have everything to do with the fact that Benjamin Netanyahu appointed people like Smotrich and Ben-Gvir. And I know them both. I met them both when I was in Israel. Ben-Gvir was a strong supporter of Meir Kahane. He had in his office, a picture of Baruch Goldstein, one of the most despicable Jews in history, who walked into a mosque and murdered, 29 Muslims at prayer. That's what it's a protest against. You know, it's a protest against the fact that the Netanyahu government, in order to get into power, had to appoint people like that. And who's at fault? I'll tell you who's at fault. Everybody in Israel is at fault. But let me tell you who's really at fault. Benny Gantz is at fault because he refused to form a coalition with Netanyahu. If he had formed a coalition with Netanyahu, they wouldn't need those characters on the extreme right. Tzipi Livni could have formed a coalition. Others on the left. The other thing is the left divided their parties into such small parties that they lost their ability even to get a single person into the Knesset. Remember, this is the same left that nominated Isaac Herzog to be prime minister. He came this close to winning just 10, 15 years ago. But then the left has become very atomized and divided, and the right picked up more votes. Of course, ultimately, it's all the fault of the Palestinian leadership. They turned down the opportunity to have a state in 1937, 1948, 1967, 1990, 2000, 2001, 2005, 2008, and it goes on. And so ultimately, it's driven Israelis to the right. There are two reasons for why Israel, when I started going to Israel, it was a left-wing country. It was a progressive, quote, left-wing country in which Begin could never get elected to anything. Shamir could never get elected to anything. Then two things happened. One, Hasidim started having babies. And of course, that's what Hasidim do. They believe, Peru Revu, babies. Your rabbi has 7, my rabbi has 9. I have a better rabbi than you do. He has 9. Is the rabbi here? Okay.
Yes.
Okay. Hi. Cain Yerboo. Okay, maybe there'll be many more. And second, I've always said there are three people at fault for the movement of right in Israel. One is Yasser Arafat by rejecting the peace deal. He destroyed the peace party. Second, it was the demographics of Hasidim and ultra-Orthodox and Haredi Jews having many more children. They tend to vote right. Then the third person at fault was me. Why was I at fault? Because I was somewhat helpful, very helpful, in bringing 800,000 Soviet Jews into Israel. Now, how do you think a Soviet Jew is going to vote when he gets in Israel, having been oppressed by left-wing communism all his life? When you combine those three factors, it created a seismic shift in the political leanings. Now, it's interesting because the children of the Russian immigrants are now moving center and moving more toward left. And actually, there are children of Haredi Jews today participating in these demonstrations. Israel, you know the old thing, 2 Jews, 3 opinions, and 2 Israelis, 12 newspapers. And so you're going to get, even within families, I have a very Orthodox family in Israel, very Orthodox family. Most of them not Haredi, but some. But most of my family votes left rather than right, even though they're very ultra-religious. So there's no direct one-on-one. The protesters represent mostly Ashkenazi Jews, but there is a considerable number of Sephardic Jews and a considerable number of Orthodox Jews who are in the protests as well. But the general shift to the right can be explained demographically. I debated Peter Beinart. Peter Beinart is a despicable anti-Israel, Jewish anti-Zionist and Israel hater. I debated him on Martha's Vineyard. This was in the days when people on Martha's Vineyard still spoke to me before I defended Donald Trump. And he said to me, he started the debate by saying, Alan, I always admired you because when I was in elementary school, you helped bring 800,000 Soviet Jews. You were my hero. Now, I don't like you anymore because you support Israel. And I said, well, we have a solution for this, Peter. Why don't we just reverse that and send the 800,000 Jews back to the Soviet Union, back to Russia? Are you in favor of that? Well, he said, of course not. I said, oh, I have a second solution. Why don't you deny Russian Jews the right to vote? No. I can't do that. Well, what would you do? What do you do when there's a demographic change? What do you do when thousands of Cuban refugees come to Florida and solidify a Republican majority in Florida? First, you try to change them. You try to be political. You hope their children, if you're a Democrat, will change. You can't send them back to Cuba, and you can't take their vote away. And it's like just crying in the wind when you bring people from another country. And Ukrainians are coming in now. You know the interesting thing? They did a little poll. They found out that people who came to Israel from the Ukraine support Russia. People who came to Israel from Russia support the Ukraine because they hate their countries, the countries they came from, because they were subject to pogroms. And the grass is always greener on the other side. And so, we have to live with the fact that Israel is no longer a kibbutz-oriented, agrarian, Ashkenazi society, and it is now one of the most diverse, multicultural, multi-ethnic, multi-religious countries in the world. They ought to be proud of that. It is also the most democratic country in the world today. There is no country that is closer to a pure democracy today than in Israel. Just look at the demonstrations and the speech and compare that to France. In France, people are killing each other. They're burning Holocaust memorials. They're destroying property. The same thing happened in parts of California and Oregon after the tragic killing of George Floyd. What's happened in Israel? Tens and tens of thousands of people demonstrating peacefully. That's democracy in action. That's democracy. And what Bill Clinton, Carol and I had dinner with Bill Clinton a few times when he was on the Vineyard. One day we were having dinner and a Jewish guy, a friend of ours, started attacking Netanyahu. And I started to answer, and Clinton hit me on the knee and said, let me take this. And he went through the whole thing. And then he said, there's only one problem with Israel. One problem. It's a democracy. Damn it. And he explained. He said, when I want Saudis to do something, one phone call. When I want the Egyptians to do something, one phone call. When I want the Jordanians, one phone call. When I want the Israelis, I call the prime minister. He says, let me check with my small cabinet, then I'll check with my big cabinet. Then we'll have a Knesset vote. Then we'll have some polling. Then we'll have this, and we'll have a judicial review. I'll be back to you in a couple of years and tell you whether I can do it. It's a democracy, damn it.
Thank you, thank you. Now, let's shift gears. A number of months ago, Rabbi Leo D's wife and his two daughters were traveling in the, quote, West Bank, Judea, Samaria, in their car. They were attacked by terrorists. They were shot, and all three women were killed.
You got it wrong. That's because you haven't been watching CNN. If you watch
That's
CNN,
exactly right.
you realize there was a shootout.
No, wait,
the
that's where I'm
6-year-old
going.
took out a gun and started shooting at these poor Arabs who shot back, and tragically in the crossfire, 2 people were killed. It has to be true. It was on CNN.
That's exactly my point. And as I understand this rabbi, after listening to Christiana Amanpour say that it was a shootout, he got in touch with you and said, what can I do here? Please take it from there. Tell us what you plan to do and what your thoughts are on the success of this, because as a board member of CAMRA, the Committee on Accuracy in Middle East Reporting in America, which is such an important
great
organization.
Please contribute to that too. Yeah.
They follow up the New York Times, the LA Times, the Washington Post, whenever there is this obvious misconstruing of what the truth really was. So here we have finally someone who's potentially going to bring a suit. Please tell us.
Well, I hope so. And I have offered my work pro bono on behalf of the family to sue them. The problem in the United States, and you can sue in the United States because the defamation occurred on CNN. The problem is you can't sue, a dead person can't sue for defamation. And so the rabbi has to bring a lawsuit based on less direct consequences, and we're in the process of figuring out. The one thing we don't want to do is bring a lawsuit and lose it. I don't like losing lawsuits, and I certainly would never like losing a lawsuit on behalf of a bereaved husband and father. So we're thinking about all of our options. We're in touch with CNN. I'm also personally suing CNN. After I made my speech in the Senate, I was asked a question on the floor of the Senate by 2 senators asking whether or not if a president engaged in a quid pro quo, that would be impeachable. And I said, well, of course not. Quid pro quos happen all the time. It was the day after some Israel event. If the prime minister, if the president of the United States said to the prime minister of Israel, we'll send you money, but if you continue to build settlements, we'll cut it down. Or if he said to the Palestinians, we'll send you money, but if you continue to pay terrorists, family will, those are quid pro quos, so they're lawful. I said, what makes a quid pro quo unlawful is if there's anything illegal about it, anything corrupt about it, anything unlawful. And I said, for a person to be impeached, it has to be, under the Constitution, treason, bribery, other high crimes and misdemeanors. A president can be impeached if he commits any of those things. CNN puts a bunch of people on the air, and they say, Dershowitz said a president can't be impeached even if he commits crimes. They said it over and over and over again. So I'm now suing them for defamation. And they lost a big suit some years ago with this young student at a Catholic school in Virginia. They now have a change of leadership, and maybe they'll become more responsible. I'm not counting on it. You'll pardon my use of some political language in front of the Torah. The best point that makes it. Lyndon Johnson once said, if you have them by the, I won't say what, their hearts and minds will follow. And that's been my legal career. You have to use, and it comes right from our davening. Tomorrow, those of you who are in shul, tonight, those of you who are in shul, you'll say the following prayer 3 times tomorrow. Hashem oz li'amo yitain, Hashem yivorech et amo b'shalom. God will give the Jewish people oz, strength, and only then will the Jewish people have shalom, peace. That was such a powerful message. And I wish the pre-Holocaust leaders of the Jewish community understood that. Morality is not enough to fight bigotry. When Rabbi Heschel wrote to Mahatma Gandhi asking him to support Israel, Gandhi said, no, you don't have to do anything to worry about. Morality is on your side. Just lie down in front of the tanks and you'll be on the moral side. You'll be dead, but you'll be on the moral side. And I think for too many years, Jews believed that their morality was their shield. We had leaders who understood that wasn't the case. Jabotinsky, Ben-Gurion, they all understood that without a strong army, Israel would never, ever survive. I think Israel has a great existential crisis that it faces now, not only Iran, but the great existential crisis is, and I spoke about this in Israel and people were shocked to hear it, not in my lifetime, and maybe not in many of your lifetimes, but Tom Friedman recently wrote that Joe Biden may be the last pro-Israel Democratic president. Israel has to become prepared for the possibility that its reliance on American largesse will be reduced and may eventually terminate. I don't think we see that in the near future. Biden made some very, very strong statements supportive of Israel, but who knows who the next Democratic candidate will be. And who knows whether the Republicans, the evangelical Christian base is the largest basis for support in the Republican Party. Today, that could change too. And so Israel has to become completely self-reliant militarily. Thank God it developed a nuclear weapon, and thank God it has the capacity to prevent Iran from developing a nuclear weapon. We all hope it doesn't have to use that capacity, but holding the sword of Damocles over Iran is very important. So, this is not going to be an easy time for Israel. It's certainly not an easy time for Jews around the world with increasing anti-Semitism. But the worst thing is Jewish anti-Zionists, Jewish anti-Semites, Temple Emmanuel in New York, which has a history of opposing Israel. It opposed the establishment of Israel. Recently, it banned me from speaking in Temple Emmanuel and instead paid $25,000 to Peter Beinart to make a speech against the right of Israel to exist as the nation state of the Jewish people. I hope if any of you are members of Temple Emmanuel in New York, you will get your resignation letter in the mail by tonight. It has been doing a horrible disservice to the Jewish community and to Israel. And it's not the only Reform synagogue in America that's doing that. Those of you who are Reformed Jews and Zionists, please use your influence, because we're losing the fight within the Reform movement. The Reform movement is the largest Jewish movement in America, and you have the ability to change that. And please act on it. It's really important.
Thank you. Now, you already spoke about the Supreme Court affirmative action cases. I want to know if you agree or disagree with this statement. Progressives should also understand that the court's students for fair admission cases effectively sound the death knell for the race-based reparations movement, meaning basically you can't give reparations if it's only to one race. Please comment on that.
It's a hard question. It's a very, very hard question. When Justice Goldberg retired from the Supreme Court, I had been his clerk, he was asked to help formulate a policy of reparation for the living Japanese Americans who had been put in detention centers in the beginning of the Second World War. Something, by the way, that was pushed by liberals. Hugo Black supported it, Abe Fortas supported it, President Roosevelt supported it. It is despicable to put people in camps based on their race. Now, they weren't concentration camps. The Japanese had a higher birth rate in the camps, but they lost a lot of money. Truck farmers on the West Coast had to sell their farms for 20 cents on the dollar. And so he asked me to help formulate that. And we decided in the end to give too little, too late, but $25,000 per family who lost farms and homes as the result of this terrible act of the United States. That's very different from, and that wasn't based on race. In other words, a Japanese American who lived in New York wasn't given anything. Only those who actually physically, not their descendants, just then. Remember, there was still quite a few who were alive there in the 70s and 80s. And, you know, a few $100 million was given out. That's very different from telling somebody who's the great-grandchild of an enslaved person that you're going to get reparations even though the people who suffered are no longer in existence. And by the way, the reparations under some proposals would apply to people who were black, African American, who just came to the United States in the last few years. It wasn't based on a heritage of enslavement, it was based just on race. If it's based just on race, it would be struck down as unconstitutional. If it's based on a heritage of enslavement, I don't think the court would strike it down as unconstitutional, but I'm not sure any state legislature today would pass it. Maybe California would. The United States Congress would not pass such a bill. And again, if you could formulate something that would help people who can show a direct harm from enslavement, that would be a very different situation.
Thank you. That's very well said.
I would add one more thing. I do think that the United States has an obligation, because of the history of enslavement, to prioritize help in poor black communities. I have made a proposal, which nobody has bought into it, but I wonder how many of you would agree with it. How many of you in the audience get Social Security checks every month? Of those who get Social Security checks every month, how many of you really need it to survive? I don't know. Okay. All right. And you should continue to get it. But I don't need it. My wife, who just became eligible, she doesn't need it. I would like to have a policy whereby people can check a box and have their Social Security payments sent to or used to help educationally, medically, the poorest people in the United States without regard to race. It's our money. We deserve it. We're entitled to keep it. And maybe we even would get a charitable deduction if we check that box. But there are so many mechanisms, so many ways of helping a poor community. So I'm completely in favor of doing that, but I want to help also the people who live in West Virginia that have been horribly affected by the opioids and all of that. You can't do it just on the basis of skin color.
You're a mensch.
So are you. Thank you.
Very, very last topic, and that is the public trust. Right now, we all are seeing a gigantic decrease in the public's trust of organizations like the FBI, like the CIA, like the CDC. Have you ever seen this kind of mistrust before?
Never, never. You know, when I was a kid, when we took school trips to Washington, the first building we ever wanted to go to was the FBI building. You know, you'd see pictures of how they got Dillinger and how they solved the Lindbergh. And, you know, we knew J. Edgar Hoover wasn't perfect, but far from it. But nonetheless, you know, we loved the FBI and we loved the local PAL, Police Athletic League. What was the Police Athletic League in my neighborhood? A bunch of Irish cops who had been 2 generations in America earlier than we. My friends, many of them were immigrants. Their fathers didn't know what baseball meant. And the PAL would raise money to get a kid a glove and to teach him how to throw a baseball. It was wonderful. We loved the policemen. Carolyn will tell you, I never, ever passed by a policeman or a soldier, ever, without stopping and saying thank you for your service. And if I knew and could identify elementary school teachers, I would say the same thing to them, and nurses and people who really make America the country that we are. But we've lost trust, and we've become, and it's, oh, by the way, the same thing's happening in Israel. The same thing is happening in Israel. People are losing trust even in the military. And it's a function of the division that we now experience. We don't talk to each other. We don't communicate. We pick sides. I like to tell people, you know, I was a fervent Brooklyn Dodger fan, which meant I hated the New York Yankees with a passion. But every time I went to a Yankee game, even recently, and Jeter would get up to bat, I would be the only person maybe in Fenway Park, but I would be cheering him. When, Mariano Rivera came to the ninth inning to pitch, I knew that meant the end of the Red Sox for this game, but I would cheer him. I mean, these are great ball players, and I cheer Republicans who are doing the right thing. And today, it's hard to do that. It's hard to have conversations. The one thing, I want to end on this note because it's so important. The one thing that Chabad does, and I can mostly talk about Chabad in two places, my places, Harvard, which now, it's one of the major organizations on campus today. By the way, if you contribute to Chabad today at Harvard campus, you are contributing to Harvard. So we've made that arrangement. And also, Carolyn and I helped to start the first Chabad on Martha's Vineyard. And we had 400 people. I spoke at the Chabad there a few weeks ago for a Friday night Shabbos dinner. And the one great thing about Chabad, people from every political point of view go there and they talk to each other and they find common ground. The one bit of advice I gave the Chabad rabbi, Hershey Zarki, who was a great, great rabbi at Harvard, when he came to me and asked me to be the faculty advisor, I said, I have two pieces of advice for you. One you can follow and the other you might not be able to. The one is, don't try to be a substitute for professors. Don't be a purely intellectual place. Hillel had become that. The rabbi of Hillel tried to be smarter than the professors. It's just not going to work. The Harvard students get all they need to nurture their brains in the class. They need to nurture their neshama. And you have to be a group that affects the neshama. So don't try to compete with the professors. Just give the students something they don't get from the professors. The other thing I said, which is much more controversial, I said for at least the first 10 years, try not to have events that require, under halacha, the separation of men from women. And for the first 10 years, they didn't do that. Then the students revolted. They wanted a minyan. They wanted a Chabad minyan. So, of course, Chabad did everything they could. It had the lowest mechitza in the history of halachic mechitzas. There was basically a few flowers and plants along the way. And as soon as they got to Aleinu, those flowers disappeared as quickly as you possibly could and everything. They just tried so hard and successfully to operate within the constraints of halacha, and I would never try to urge any rabbi or Orthodox Jew to change his way and to change the way that has been the Jewish way for years, but to try as best as possible. I have a rabbi friend who is the rabbi in Maryland, Orthodox shul in Maryland. He said he asked the engineers to build him two mechitzas, a very low one to separate the men and women, and a very high one to block his view of the parking lot, so he doesn't see which of his congregants have driven to shul. Jews, rabbis, good rabbis have seichel in addition to intellectual smarts, and so I just want to urge all of you to continue to contribute as much as you can to Chabad, to make Chabad one of the most important organizations in Aspen, to use Chabad to present the Jewish perspective to the wonderful people we've loved. We've only been in Aspen a couple of days. I'm thinking about moving here. No, it's so nice. It's just great. And in addition to contributing to Chabad, I would urge you also to contribute to grassroots Jewish organizations, from the bottom up Jewish organizations, like Stand With Us, like Camera, and I'm not going to mention them all, but organizations that really reflect the will of the people rather than the kind of top-down organizations that have not served the Jewish community well since the 1920s and 1930s. Sure, continue to contribute to them, but just make sure there's enough around to have the smaller bottom-up organizations operate. Look, we are a marvelous people who can't help fighting with each other and can't help creating a controversy. We have brought so much to the world. No country in the history of the world has ever contributed more to humanity in the first 75 years of its existence than Israel. I challenge anyone. I go to speak at colleges. I challenge everybody to name a country. Not the United States, nobody. The United States contributed enormously to the world, but not in the first 75 years. The same is true of civil liberties. No organization, no country faced with threats comparable to the threats faced by Israel from Iran, from terrorism, from its own civil disobedience, from anti-Semitism. No country faced with comparable threats has ever had a better record of civil liberties, better record of human rights, a better record with compliance with the rule of law. So continue to be proud of being a Jew, proud of being a Zionist, never be ashamed of it, and may you all go from strength to strength. Thank you so much for the privilege, and Shabbat Shalom.